Hunger did not come at Mako Grey Wolf like a clean pain. It scraped. It moved under his ribs with the patient teeth of a winter rat hollowing him from the inside until every breath felt too large for the empty place it entered. His belly had stopped growling 2 days ago. That was worse than hunger. A growl meant the body still argued. Silence meant it had begun to understand. He came down from the high ridges beneath the backbone of the world, with snow frozen in his beard and blood dried black beneath one thumbnail. The elk had gone deep into the timber where no man with a cracked boot and a half-dead fire in his chest could follow. His snares had given him nothing but ice-stiff rabbit hair and pine needles. The last meat he had eaten was a strip of old deer hide boiled until the water turned gray. He had not spoken to another human being since the leaves were yellow. The wind off the mountains cut through his buffalo coat and found every place where the stitching had rotted. It pushed snow sideways across the dark timber and hissed along the frozen creek beds. Mako moved through it with the heavy care of a wounded animal, one hand on the stock of his rifle, the other pressed against his middle as if he could hold himself together by force. He saw the smoke before he saw the cabin. A thin gray thread climbed out of the dusk and unraveled beneath the low sky. Mako stopped among the black pines, his breath smoking hard. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. People meant dogs, rifles, suspicion, and sometimes food. He should have turned away. Instead, he stood there while the hunger made the decision for him. The cabin sat close to a creek that had frozen white along the edges and black in the middle where the current still fought. A barn leaned nearby, its pine boards silvered by weather, its roof bent under old snow. A low corral held 2 horses standing rump to the wind. The woodpile by the cabin wall was too small for the season. One window glowed yellow. No man's tracks cut the yard. Only one set of boot marks crossed between cabin, barn, and pump. A widow's place. Mako's jaw tightened. A widow alone in that country was either iron or already finished, sometimes both. He did not want the house. He told himself that. He did not want to see a woman's face go white at the sight of him. He did not want to hear a child cry. He wanted hay. He wanted maybe a handful of oats if the horses had not eaten all. He wanted one warm corner where the cold would not take his toes before morning. At dawn, he would steal what little he could and vanish back toward the timber. He waited until the wind rose hard enough to cover the sound of his boots, then crossed the yard in a low, silent line. His rifle hung heavy across his back. His knife rode at his belt bone handle, worn smooth by years of bad weather and worse choices. At the barn door, he pressed his thumb against the iron latch to keep it from clanking. The latch betrayed him anyway. It let out a thin, miserable squeal that cut through the yard like a frightened thing. Mako froze. The horses shifted inside. One blew hard through its nose. He listened for a dog, for a shout, for the scrape of a rifle being lifted from pegs. Nothing. He slipped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The barn air was warmer than the world outside, thick with hay dust, horse sweat, old manure, and leather. Mako stood still until his eyes adjusted. The horses watched him from their stalls with bright, suspicious eyes. He did not go near them. Animals knew hunger when it entered a room. He found an empty stall and lowered himself into the hay. His knees cracked loud in the dark. Pain moved up his legs, dry and old, like rusted wire being pulled through bone. He dragged loose hay over his boots and sat with his back against the board's knife across his thigh. Sleep came near, then backed away. His stomach cramped. A low sound escaped him before he could stop it. Not a word, not quite a groan. Something meaner, smaller. Then the barn door opened. Lantern light spilled across the floor. Mako's hand closed around the knife. "I know you're in here," a woman said. Her voice did not tremble. It had no sweetness in it. It was flat-tired and rough at the edges like a shovel scraping frozen ground. Mako did not move. "The horses don't stomp at ghosts," she said. "And that latch hasn't cried like that since I oiled it." The lantern lifted. Light found him in pieces, the torn buffalo coat, the wild beard, the rifle stock above his shoulder, the knife blade dull and yellow in his hand. The woman stepped fully into the barn. She was not young, though she was not yet old. Hard years had made those measures useless. Her hair was black and pulled back tight with loose strands stuck to her temples. A wool shawl lay over her shoulders. Her dress was faded, patched at the elbows and dark at the hem from snowmelt. In one hand she held the lantern, in the other she held a pitchfork, its iron tines angled toward the dirt but ready enough. She did not carry herself like a frightened woman. That made Mako more careful. "I ain't here to hurt you," he rasped. The words tore out of his throat like burrs. His own voice startled him. It sounded buried. The woman studied him. Not the knife, not the rifle, not the breadth of him crouched in the hay like something that had crawled out of the timber. She looked at his face, at the hollows beneath his cheekbones, at the way his shoulders hung under the heavy coat. "You look like the mountain tried to eat you and lost interest halfway through," she said. Mako blinked. He had expected fear. He had expected disgust. He had expected the pitchfork to lift or a rifle to speak from the doorway behind her. He had not expected a dry assessment. "Snow's deep," he said, that all his pride rose. A brittle thing, thin as ice and just as useless. He opened his mouth to tell her he would be gone by morning, that he wanted nothing that she could go back to her fire and forget she had seen him. But his stomach twisted so violently he bent forward over the knife and sucked air through his teeth. The woman heard it. Something changed in her face, though it was not softness. It was recognition. Grim, unwilling, practical recognition. She lowered the pitchfork. "Have you eaten?" The question hung in the barn dust. Mako stared at her. There was no pity in her eyes, no trembling mercy. She asked it the way a person might ask if a roof leaked or a horse had gone lame. A fact to be dealt with, a problem to be measured before it became worse. His hand tightened on the knife, then loosened. "No," he said. The word was almost nothing. The woman turned toward the door. "Come inside before you freeze stiff and make me drag your carcass out of my hay." She did not wait to see if he followed. Mako sat there a moment longer, knife in hand, listening to her boots cross the frozen yard. The lantern light swung away, leaving the barn darker than before. He should have stayed. He should have let her go. A house was worse than a storm. A storm only wanted to kill you. A house wanted you to remember things. Warmth, voices, tables, the sound of another person breathing in sleep. Mako sheathed the knife and forced himself up. His legs trembled once before they held. He followed the lantern through the wind. The heat inside the cabin struck him hard enough to stop him at the threshold. It smelled of wood smoke, boiled beans, dried meat, lye soap, damp wool, and something faintly sweet, maybe choke cherries drying in a cloth sack near the rafters. The room was small and severely ordered. Cast iron pans hung by size. Firewood was stacked with straight, punishing precision. A Winchester rested near the wall within reach of the door. A patched bison robe lay folded beside a narrow cot. Near the stove, small moccasins sat drying on a peg. Mako saw them and felt the room shrink. "A child." The woman shut the door behind him. "Coat off," she said. "You're dripping on my floor." Mako fumbled with the toggles. His fingers were stiff, clumsy, too large for the task. When the coat came free, the smell of his own body rose around him. Old sweat, smoke, grease, blood, dirt, months of being more animal than man. He hung the coat where she pointed. "Sit." He lowered himself into a ladder-back chair at the table. The chair creaked under him in protest. He went still, afraid to move and break it. The woman set a tin plate before him. Beans, dried meat, grease shining at the edges, 2 hard pieces of dark bread. His mouth flooded so quickly he nearly choked. "Name's Saxena Red Willow," she said, setting a wooden spoon beside the plate. "Don't make noise when you chew if you can help it." Mako tried to eat slowly. He truly tried. The first bite broke him. Heat and salt hit his tongue, and the man he had been fell away. He bent over the plate and shoveled food into his mouth, barely chewing breath rough through his nose. Shame burned the back of his neck, but hunger was stronger. The bread scraped the plate clean. Beans disappeared. Grease slicked his beard. In less than 2 minutes there was nothing left but the dull shine of tin. Only then did he look up. Saxena was not watching him. She sat near the stove, mending a shirt needle flashing through cloth. Her hands were red at the knuckles, rough from cold water and work. A plain ring hung loose on one finger. Her face was still but tired in a way sleep would not mend. Behind a hanging blanket something shifted. A girl's face appeared in the gap, thin, dark-eyed, hair braided loose from sleep. She could not have been more than 9 or 10. She stared at Mako without crying. He looked away first. Saxena noticed but said nothing. "There's water in the pitcher," she said. Mako poured a cup and drank. His hand shook less afterward. "Mako," he said. Saxena pushed the needle through the cloth. "I didn't ask." "No," but the silence pressed on him until he added Mako Grey Wolf. The girl behind the blanket whispered, "Is he a wolf?" Saxena did not look up, not if he has sense enough to stay by the stove. The girl disappeared again. Mako sat rigidly at the table, feeling the weight of the child's question settle somewhere under his ribs. He had been called worse, by enemies, by white traders, by men he had left bleeding in mining camps and frozen gullies. But from a child's mouth the word sounded different, cleaner, more dangerous. "You shouldn't let strangers in," he said, "especially men looking like me." Saxena tied off the thread with her teeth. "You think I don't know that?" "Then why?" She finally looked at him. Her eyes were pale brown, steady and dry. "A starving wolf at the door is trouble," she said. "A fed one mostly sleeps. It was not kindness. That was what made it bearable." "I'll be gone at first light," Mako said. "Suit yourself." She folded the mended shirt and stood. "Floor's warmer than the barn. Don't touch the rifle. Don't touch the girl. Don't die where I have to step over you in the dark." She carried the lantern behind the hanging blanket. A moment later, the cabin dropped into ember light. Mako unrolled his bedroll near the stove. He kept his boots on. He kept the knife under his hand. He listened to the wind worry the walls and the horses shifting in the barn. Somewhere outside, the iron latch banged once in the cold. A broken thing. A small thing. A thing he knew how to fix. He closed his eyes, meaning only to rest them. Warmth pressed into his bones. Food sat heavy in his belly. The woman and the child breathed behind the blanket, steady as banked coals. For the first time in years, Mako Grey Wolf slept without hearing the mountain call his name. He walked 50 yards toward the timber before the broken latch. The low woodpile and the child's thin wrists pulled him back harder than any chain ever could. Morning had come without mercy. The cabin window was gray with frost, the kind that made the world outside look dead and far away. Mako Grey Wolf opened his eyes to the sound of coffee beans grinding in an iron mill. For one raw second, he did not know where he was. His hand closed around the knife under his blanket fingers, tight on the bone handle. Then the smell came back to him. Wood smoke, beans, damp wool, lye soap, a woman's house. He lay still on the floor by the stove, staring at the black iron belly of it, where orange light breathed behind the grate. His bones felt heavy, not weak exactly. Fed. That was a different kind of danger. Hunger kept a man sharp. Food made him remember he had once been human. Behind the hanging blanket, the girl coughed once in her sleep. Mako's hand loosened on the knife. Six in a red willow stood at the counter with her back to him, turning the crank of the coffee grinder. Her movements were plain and exact. No wasted motion, no softness offered to the morning. She wore the same faded dress, but a clean apron had been tied over it. Her hair was braided tight and pinned at the back of her head. The pale light showed the red cracks across her knuckles. Mako sat up slowly. The floorboards complained beneath him. His back had stiffened during the night and his knees popped when he drew them under him. He hated the sound. It made him feel old. Worse, it made him feel heard. Saxena did not turn. "Coffee'll be bitter," she said. "Ain't staying for it." The crank stopped, only for a moment. Then she started grinding again. "Suit yourself," that was all. Mako rolled his bedroll with tight, hard movements. He tied it off, stood and reached for his buffalo coat on the peg. The coat had dried stiff overnight. It smelled worse in the warmth than it had in the cold. He pulled it over his shoulders and felt the weight of the mountain return to him. The girl, Mara Littlebird, sat up behind the blanket. Her hair was loose around her face. She looked at him as if she had been awake for some time. "You leaving?" she asked. Her voice was small, but not frightened. Mako looked toward the door. That's the way of things. What things, he had no answer for that. Saxena poured boiling water into the coffee pot. Steam rose around her face. "Let him go, Mara." The girl lowered her eyes. "I didn't hold him." No one spoke after that. Mako took his rifle from the wall where he had leaned. It opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air struck him clean across the face. It should have felt good. It should have been a relief. The cabin had been too warm, too close, too full of breath and old grief and things that could ask questions without speaking. The yard lay under a hard crust of snow. Dawn had barely lifted. The creek beyond the corral murmured under ice. The horses stood with their heads low, steam rising from their nostrils. The barn roof sagged under a white load, and the wind had combed loose snow into narrow blue shadows along the walls. Mako walked toward the timber. He did not look back. A man who looked back was already caught. His boots crunched through the crust. Every step took him closer to the black pines where he knew how to be empty. Up there, no one cared if he stank. No one put food in front of him and forced him to feel the shame of needing it. No child asked where he was going. No woman pretended not to watch his hands. He made it 50 yards. Then the barn latch banged behind him. Once, twice. A thin, ugly sound in the wind. Mako stopped. He stared at the timber line. The trees stood closer together, dark and patient. They had taken him in before. They would take him again. They would give him cold ground hard silence, and maybe death if the elk stayed high and the snares stayed empty. The latch banged again. He saw it in his mind. Rusted iron, warped catch, screws half loose from weather, a small thing, a stupid thing. But small broken things became large trouble in winter. A loose latch let wind in. Wind spooked horses broke boards. Broken boards killed animals or men who depended on them. Then he thought of the wood pile. Too low. A widow could freeze to death slowly while still walking around making coffee. He thought of Saxina's hands red from cold water. He thought of Mara's moccasins by the stove cracked at the toe. He thought of the girl offering no fear because she had not yet learned all the reasons she should. Mako closed his eyes. "Damn it," he whispered. The words smoked white in the air. He turned around. He did not go to the cabin. He went straight to the barn, straight to the... Inside, the horses shifted and watched him. He set his rifle down near the wall and found a small toolbox beneath a shelf of harness leather. There was a rusted file inside a bent screwdriver, 2 square nails and a twist of old wire. Poor tools, but tools all the same. He took the latch off the door, working the screws loose with the tip of his knife when the screwdriver slipped. The iron was warped where the catch had rubbed it raw. Rust had swollen one edge. He sat on a chopping stump outside the barn and filed it down. The sound of iron against iron scraped through the morning. Steady, harsh, useful. His hands knew what to do. That was a mercy, too. A man could get lost inside his own head if his hands had nothing honest to hold. By the time he reattached the latch, the wind had picked up. He closed the barn door. It settled into place with a clean, dull click. No squeal, no cry, just done. Mako stood there with the file in his hand, staring at the door like a fool. The cabin door opened behind him. Saxina stood on the porch with a tin cup in her hand. Coffee steamed from it. She had a shawl over her shoulders, and the morning cold sharpened her face into something carved. She did not say thank you. She only held the cup out a little. Mako walked over but stopped at the bottom step. He took the coffee. Their fingers did not touch. It was black bitter and hot enough to burn his tongue. "Latch was bad," he said. "I heard it stop complaining." He drank again. The coffee hit his empty places with a violence almost as strong as food. "Wood's low," he said. Saxina looked toward the pile stacked against the cabin wall. "Axe is in the shed. Maul's got a split handle. I can wrap it." "Rawhide's hanging by the door." She turned and went inside. Mako stood with the cup in his hand until the door closed. Then he finished the coffee, set the cup on the porch rail, and went to the shed. The maul handle was split clean down one side, not broken yet, but waiting. He found the rawhide, soaked it in a pan of snowmelt near the stove ashes, and wrapped the handle tight. Wet rawhide shrank mean when it dried. It would hold. Then he began to chop. The first swing jarred his shoulders. The second split a round of frozen pine clean in half. The third felt better. Soon the rhythm took him. Swing, crack, breathe, toss, swing, crack, breathe, toss. The sound moved across the yard and came back from the ridge. His body warmed under the coat. Sweat dampened his shirt despite the cold. Hunger had made his arms hollow, but the food from the night before had given him just enough fire to burn. By noon, the pile had grown. By mid-afternoon, it had doubled. Mako worked until his hands went numb and then worked past that. He did not know how to repay food with words. Words were thin. Wood was solid. A fixed latch was solid. Ice broken from a trough was solid. These things could stand in the world after a man shut his mouth. A horse nickered. Mako paused with the maul in both hands. An old man rode into the yard on a small dark horse crusted with snow along the legs. He wore a worn robe pulled around his shoulders and a hat whose brim had lost its shape years ago. His face was brown and narrow, cut deep with lines, his eyes black and bright beneath heavy lids. He looked first at the cabin, then at the woodpile, then at Mako. The old man did not reach for the rifle tied along his saddle. He didn't need to. Suspicion sat on him plainly enough. Saxina came out onto the porch. "Old bear runner," she said. "Saxina." His eyes stayed on Mako. "You keeping winter wolves now?" Mako set the maul head against the chopping block. He said nothing. Saxina crossed her arms. "This one fixed my latch. A wolf can learn a latch if there's meat behind it." The old man dismounted slowly, stiff in the knees, but not weak. Mara appeared in the doorway behind Saxina, half hidden by her skirt. Old Bear Runner saw her, and his face softened by a degree so small most would miss it. He took a bundle from his saddlebag and handed it to Saxina. Dried meat wrapped in cloth, a small pouch of tobacco, something else Mako could not see. "For the girl," he said. Mara stepped forward and took the smaller bundle. "Thank you," the old man grunted. Inside the cabin, while Saxena warmed coffee for him, Old Bear Runner spoke low. Mako stood outside near the woodpile, but the walls were thin and the wind carried sound in pieces. A starving wolf may sleep by the fire, Old Bear Runner said, but he still remembers teeth. Saxena's answer came flat and clear. So do the men who come smiling. A pause followed. Then the old man said, "Saw tracks below the crossing. 3 riders, not families, not hunters. Whiskey smell on the trail, and 1 horse near lame. Spring will bring worse." Saxena said nothing. Mako looked toward the lower trail, only snow and trees, but his hand had tightened around the maul handle. That evening he broke ice in the trough and carried slop to the pigs. Saxena did not ask. She stood in the doorway with a bucket and said, "Troughs froze. Pigs need feeding." He took the bucket. The sour stink of peelings and old milk rose up into his face. It was an ugly chore, a necessary one. He found himself glad of it. Inside, after dark, they ate beans and hard bread. Old Bear Runner had gone before sunset, leaving behind no farewell but the marks of his horse in the snow. Mara sat across from Mako and watched him less fearfully than before. When the fire burned low, Saxena sent the girl to bed. Mako lay again near the stove, though this time the blanket placed there was thicker. He did not ask who had put it down. Near midnight, he woke to a soft sound. Mara was crouched near his cot, placing a piece of hard bread beside his hand. She moved like she expected to be scolded by the floorboards. Mako kept still until she slipped back behind the blanket. He looked at the bread for a long time. His belly wanted it. His hand did not move. Before dawn, he placed it beside her bowl on the table. When Mara woke, she saw it there. She looked at him. He looked at the stove. Neither of them spoke. Outside, wind dragged loose snow across the yard. Far down past the frozen creek beyond the black pines and the bend in the lower trail, 3 riders moved through the dusk of early morning, their horses thin, their coats dark with old weather, their laughter too faint to hear from the cabin. Mako did not see them, but the horses in the barn lifted their heads all at once, ears pricked toward the south, listening to something the people had not yet heard. He had hidden the wound because useless things were left to die, but when the widow cut the rot from his leg, it was her dead husband's scream she was fighting. The storm came down before noon and sealed the world shut. Snow moved sideways across the yard, hard as thrown sand, erasing the tracks Old Bear Runner's horse had left and burying the lower rails of the corral. The black pines disappeared behind a white curtain. The creek went quiet under ice and drift. Even the mountains vanished, though Mako could still feel them out there, shouldering the sky, cold and patient, and waiting for him to return. Inside the cabin, there was no room for the mountains. There was only the stove, the table, the hanging blanket, the smell of boiled beans, damp wool, wood smoke, and human breath. Mako learned the cabin the way a man learns dangerous ground. He learned the board near the stove that groaned under the heel. He learned the place where the roof ticked when wind shoved snow beneath the eaves. He learned that Saxena rose once in the deep night to check the fire, and that Mara turned in her sleep toward warmth like a pup in a den. He learned to move his large body through the small room with his shoulders slightly bent, as if he could make himself less of a burden by taking up less air. They spoke little. Words cost something in winter. Morning was coffee if there was enough hot water if there was not. Breakfast was oats thinned past decency, or hard bread softened in broth. Saxena rationed food with cold arithmetic. Mara accepted her portions without complaint, though her eyes sometimes followed the spoon back to the pot. Mako saw it. He pretended not to. He ate everything placed before him but never reached for more. The woodpile fell and rose beneath his hands. He chopped when the wind allowed it and carried armloads inside until the corner stack stood high against the wall. He broke ice from the trough with an iron bar. He rubbed down the horses when their coats crusted with frozen sweat. He hauled water from the pump in buckets that froze around the rims before he reached the door. Work held him together. Still, the cabin had a way of loosening old things. One afternoon, with the storm beating so hard against the walls that the lamp flame trembled, Mako sat at the table cleaning his rifle. The sharps lay in pieces on an oiled rag. His hands moved carefully over the dark metal, wiping moisture from the breech block, running a cloth down the barrel, checking the extractor with the steady patience of a man who trusted iron more than people. Saxena kneaded dough at the counter. Her palms pushed, folded, turned, pushed, folded, turned. Mara sat near the stove, mending a tear in one of her stockings with more determination than skill. For a while, the only sounds were window and metal. Then Mako snapped the action shut. The clack cracked through the cabin. Saxena stopped. Not for long. Not enough for most men to notice. But Mako noticed. Her shoulders hardened, her breath caught, and did not come back right away. He lowered the rifle across his knees. "Oh, I see." "Too loud," he said. She wiped flour from her fingers. Eli used to clean his colt at that table. Mara stopped sewing. Saxena did not turn around, clicking the hammer back, letting it down, clicking it again, all evening sometimes. Her voice stayed flat, but something lived under it, something with teeth. When the fever took him, I could still hear it. Click, 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 like death practicing before it came in. Meko looked toward the table boards. He had seen the grave behind the barn his second day there, a simple wooden marker half buried in snow. He had not asked. A man did not poke at a fresh grave unless he wanted the dead to answer. "I'll clean it in the shed," he said. "It's freezing in the shed. I've known cold. Don't make the walls remember him," she said. The words stayed in the room after she went back to the dough. Meko wrapped the rifle parts in the rag and set them near his cot. He moved slowly, carefully, making no sound at all. That night, the old wound in his calf began to pulse. It had started weeks before, high in the timber, while he was cutting hide from a frozen elk carcass he had found half buried near a ravine. The knife had slipped. The blade bit deep through canvas and flesh. He had packed the cut with pine pitch, bound it with a strip torn from his shirt, and kept walking. Cold made a man believe lies about his body. Cold tightened everything, slowed blood, dulled pain, hid rot. But the cabin was warm. The wound woke under that warmth like something hateful coming out of sleep. At first, Mako ignored it. Pain was just weather inside the skin. Then the calf tightened. The flesh around the cut grew hot and hard. By the second day, each step sent a red spark up his leg. By the third, sweat crawled along his back while the room stayed cold enough for frost to cling to the window corners. He said nothing. A useful man had a place near the stove. A useless one belonged outside with the other broken things. Saxena watched him. He felt it. Her eyes would touch his limp, then leave it alone. That was worse than questions. The storm did not break. On the fourth day, he went to the shed to split kindling. He should have stayed inside. He knew it when he lifted the maul, and the handle felt far away in his hands. The shed swayed around him. The cold air burned in his lungs, but sweat ran into his beard. He set a pine round on the block, swung. The maul glanced off the edge with a violent crack, twisting his shoulders. Pain burst through his legs so bright it blinded him. His left knee folded. He hit the sawdust and snow hard enough to knock the breath out of him. For a moment, he lay staring at the roof slats while the storm sifted white dust through the gaps. "Get up," he told himself. The body did not listen. He rolled to his side. The calf felt swollen tight as a water skin. Something wet had soaked through the old bandage and into his trouser leg. The smell reached him, then sour and sweet and rotten. Fear moved through him cold as creek water. Not fear of death, fear of being found weak. He dragged himself up by the chopping block and limped toward the cabin. Every step was a nail driven through the bone. He made it to the door, pushed it open, and stepped into warmth. Saxena turned from the stove. Mako tried to walk past her. His boot caught the edge of the braided rug. He fell. The stool beside the table went over with him. The sound filled the room. Mara cried out behind the blanket. Mako planted both hands on the floor and tried to rise, but his arms trembled like wet rawhide. "Get up," Saxena said. "I'm fine. You stink like dead meat." He clamped one hand over his left leg. She saw it. In 3 steps, she was beside him. She slapped his hand away with a crack sharp enough to make Mara go silent. "Leave it," Mako growled. Saxena yanked the trouser leg up. The bandage beneath had gone black and yellow. The skin around it was swollen red, fading purple at the edges. Thin red lines crawled up toward his knee. For the first time since he had entered her barn, Saxena looked afraid. Then the fear burned into anger. "You stupid, stubborn fool," she whispered. "I can drain it. It is draining." Her voice cut flat and hard. "That is the problem." She stood. The kettle slammed onto the stove. She grabbed a basin, lye soap linen strips, a bottle of raw liquor, and a small knife from the counter. She ran the blade once, twice, 3 times across a stone. "Table," she said. "No, table." I said no. She turned on him, then eyes pale and terrible in the lamplight. "I buried Eli in ground, so frozen old bear runner had to break it with an axe before we could dig. I'm not digging another hole because a man thinks pain is proof of courage." Mako stared at her. Mara had come out from behind the blanket, face white. Saxena pointed without looking. Barn, get the extra blanket. Stay with the horses until I call you. The girl hesitated. Go. Mara went. Mako dragged himself to the table because there was no strength left to refuse. The boards were cold against his back. He gripped the edges until his knuckles whitened. Sixna cut the trouser leg open to the knee. The stink rose thick and shameful. She soaked a rag in boiling water, wrung it with hands that must have burned, and pressed it over the pitch-hardened bandage. Mako roared. The sound tore out of him before pride could stop it. His back arched. The table groaned. Hold still. Damn you. Hold still or lose the leg. She ripped the bandage free. Dark blood and pus spilled down his calf onto the table. Sixina poured liquor straight into the wound. His vision went black at the edges. He bit his lip until copper filled his mouth. She leaned across his knees when he tried to jerk away. Don't move. Her voice was shaking now. She set the knife tip to the gray-dead flesh and began to scrape. Mako had known knife pain, bullet pain, frostbite, broken bone. This was different. This was invasion. This was being opened and cleaned against his will, being forced to live by another person's hands. Sixina worked with hatred in her face. Not hatred for him, for the rot. Eli stepped on a nail. She said each word dragged through clenched teeth. A little thing, barely bled. He laughed at me for washing it, said he'd had worse from rose thorns. The knife scraped again. Mako stopped fighting. Sweat ran into his eyes. Then the foot swelled. Then the red went up his leg. Then he screamed 3 days and begged me to cut it off after it was too late. Her breath hitched once. Only once. I could not cut the death out of him. She poured more liquor. Mako's hands crushed the table edge. I will cut it out of you. That was when he understood. She was not saving Mako Grey Wolf, not exactly. She was kneeling over a ghost with a knife in her hand, fighting the same cruel, stupid death that had already taken one man from this room. So he gave her what he had. Stillness. He let his body go heavy. He fixed his eyes on the rafters and breathed through his nose while she scraped washed, packed, and bound. The pain became a country without roads. He crossed it one breath at a time. When it was done, Sixina stepped back. Her hands were red to the wrist. She swayed once and caught herself on the table. Mako turned his head. His voice came out ruined. You should have let me rot. Sixina looked at the blood on her hands. I have buried enough men who mistook silence for strength. She washed at the basin until her skin went raw. Then she covered him with a blanket, banked the stove, and set broth to simmer as if the room were not full of blood and fever, and all the dead it had remembered. The night passed in pieces. Mara left water near his cot without looking at the wound. Old Bear Runner came sometime after dark, snow crusting his robe, and sat by the door with his rifle across his knees. He said little. Once when Mako opened his eyes, the old man was watching Sixina, not him. The fever climbed. Mako dreamed of wolves under the snow, of Eli's colt clicking in the dark, of Mara's bread by his hand, of Sixina's voice ordering him not to die because the woodpile would not turn itself. Near dawn, the heat broke. He woke shaking under damp blankets, hollowed out but alive. The cabin was gray and still. Sixina slept in the chair near the stove, her head tipped back, one blood-stained cloth still gripped in her hand. Outside, something dripped from the roof. Once, then again, then steadily. The snow had begun to give way. The snow melted, the creek rose, and the world turned to mud. But inside the widow's cabin, the silence between them began to lose its teeth. Mako Grey Wolf woke to the sound of water. Not the hard slap of river water against stones, not the clean rush of a mountain stream in thaw, but a small, stubborn dripping from the roof edge beyond the wall. Drop after drop, patient as a woman counting debts. The sound worked through his fever-dulled head until he opened his eyes and found the cabin washed in a gray light that did not belong to winter anymore. The stove had been banked low. A thin red glow lived inside its iron belly. The air smelled of old sweat, lye soap, dried blood broth, wood smoke, and the faint sweet dust of choke cherries hanging near the rafters. His blankets were damp beneath him. His shirt clung cold to his chest. The fever had gone out of him during the night and taken half his strength with it. He lay still and listened. Drip, drip, drip. The world was giving way. Mako turned his head. Sixina's chair near the stove was empty. The blood-stained cloth was gone. The basin had been scrubbed clean and turned upside down beside the hearth. Mara's blanket was folded tight behind the hanging curtain. No one was inside. For a moment, the emptiness felt like abandonment. Then he saw the cup of water on the floor beside his cot and the strip of clean linen folded over the back of the chair. Not abandoned. Measured. He pushed the blanket off and sat up. Pain seized his left calf sharp enough to whiten his vision. He locked his jaw until it passed. The leg felt wrong under him, heavy and stiff, as if some other man's limb had been tied to his knee while he slept. The bandage was clean wrapped tight, but not cruel. A yellow stain showed where the wound had drained through. He hated the sight of it. A wound was not only pain. A wound was proof. Proof that the body could fail. Proof that a man could be laid flat on a table while a woman cut rot from him and a child heard him roar through the wall. He gripped the cot edge and stood. The room tilted. He caught himself on the chair, breathing hard through his nose. Sweat broke across his back, though the cabin was cool. His left foot touched the floor and the calf pulled tight as rawhide dried too fast by a fire. He took one step, then another. Pride was a poor crutch, but it was the only one he trusted. He made it to the wash basin. The pitcher water was cold enough to bite. He poured some into the basin and splashed his face. The shock cleared the last fever fog from his eyes. In the small, warped mirror above the shelf, he saw a man hollowed by sickness. His beard was wild. His cheeks had sunk. His eyes looked too large and too dark under the brow. He looked like something dragged back from death and not yet convinced it belonged among the living. The door banged open. Cold, wet air rushed in, carrying the smell of thawed earth manure, pine rot, and creek mud. Saxena stepped inside with a basket of laundry braced against one hip. The clothes inside were twisted and wet steam rising faintly from them in the warmer air. She stopped when she saw him standing. Her eyes moved down to his leg, then back to his face. "You're up," she said. "Fever's gone. I know. You quit talking to dead people before dawn." He frowned. His throat felt scraped raw. "What did I say?" "Nothing useful." She kicked the door shut with her heel and crossed to the line strung near the back wall. Her hands plunged into the basket, pulling out a damp shirt. She snapped it once and pinned it up. Mako waited for her to tell him to sit, to ask how he felt, to say the wound needed rest. She did none of those things. "The bottom logs in the woodpile will rot if they sit another day," she said. "Mud's halfway to the porch step. Trough needs clearing too." Mako stared at her. A lesser kindness might have undone him. Broth, worry, a hand on his shoulder, some soft lie about taking his time. Saxena gave him work. It hit him deeper. She was not treating him like a dying man. She was handing him back his weight. He reached for his coat. "Eat first," she said. "I can work. You can fall face first in my yard after you eat. There are cold biscuits in the tin." Mako took one from the tin box on the shelf. It was hard as packed clay and tasted of ash flour and stubborn survival. He chewed slowly, washing it down with water. Saxena hung another shirt and did not watch him. Behind the curtain, Mara's voice came small and sharp. "You look gray." Mako turned. The girl stood with one braid half-tied, the other hanging loose over her shoulder. She studied him with the same solemn suspicion she gave storm clouds and spoiled milk. "I feel gray," he said. Mara considered that. "Gray things still stand," she said. Saxena glanced at the child but said nothing. Mako went outside. The yard had become a brown, sucking mess. Snow still clung in dirty banks along the fence lines, but the open ground had turned to mud mixed with manure, straw, and meltwater. Every step made a wet sound. The creek below the cabin had swollen fat and dark shouldering ice chunks downstream. The air held no spring sweetness. It smelled like a grave opening after a long freeze. Mako stood on the porch and looked across the place. Winter had hidden the damage. Thaw revealed it. The barn path had sunk into a trough of muck. The lower woodpile leaned wet against the ground. One corral post had shifted with frost heave. Water pooled near the shed door. The roof above the pump dripped steadily from 3 places. The world had not become kinder. It had only changed weapons. He limped to the woodpile. The first log he lifted made his leg throb hard enough to bring sweat to his upper lip. He paused with the wood in his hands until the pain settled, then kept going. He turned the bottom logs, stacking the dry ones higher and dragging the wet ones into a loose row where air could reach them. Each bend pulled at the wound. Each step reminded him that he was not the man who had walked down from the high ridges, not anymore. By noon his shirt was damp with sweat and his hands were muddy to the wrists. He rested once against the chopping block, ashamed of how his breath came. The maul leaned nearby. He looked at it and felt the old urge to prove something stupid. The cabin door opened. Saxena came out carrying a cup. "You split that wound open, I'll sew your trouser leg to the cot and leave you there till summer." Mako took the cup. Broth, hot and thin. You always threaten the people you feed, only the foolish ones. He drank. The broth warmed him in a way pride could not. After that, the days took on a muddy rhythm. Mako moved slower than before, but he moved. He dug a trench from the barn path toward the creek, carving through wet clay while his boots sank to the ankles. He cleared ice from the trough with the iron bar. He rubbed mud from the horses' legs and checked their hooves for stones. He patched the shed roof with pine boards and strips of hide. He cut away old willow branches leaning over the pump. He repaired a stall board that had been kicked loose sometime in the storm. The work hurt. The work helped. Inside the cabin, something altered by inches. Saxena still did not soften. She still gave commands as if kindness were a thing best hidden under chores. But when Mako sharpened his knife at dusk, she moved the lantern closer without being asked. When she reached for the flour tin, he leaned back before her sleeve brushed his shoulder. When he stood too long on the bad leg, she set a bucket down harder than necessary and told him there was no prize for dying upright. Mara stopped hiding behind Saxena's skirt. One evening, while Mako was cutting a new peg for the chair he had nearly broken his first night, she crouched nearby and watched his knife. "That chair screamed when you sat in it," she said. "It was weak. It was old. Old things can be weak. Old Bear Runner is old." Mako shaved a curl of wood from the peg. Old Bear Runner would bite through a rope before he admitted weakness. Mara thought that over. So would Saxena. Yes, so would you. Mako didn't answer. The chair's back rail had been loose for years, maybe longer. He worked glue into the gap, drove the peg in tight, then bound the joint while it dried. His hands were steady with small work. They had killed trapped skinned built fires in snow-broken bone, but they could mend too when given the chance. Saxena watched from the stove and pretended not to. A day later, Old Bear Runner rode in under a low sky, his horse splattered to the belly with mud. He came without calling out, as if the land had sent him. Mako was near the corral, cutting lodgepole pine to size for the lower fence. His limp had settled into him by then, a slight drag when he tired. Old Bear Runner saw it. The old man saw everything. Saxena met him at the porch. "Creek's up," she said. "Creek is not what I came to warn you about." The air changed. Mako set the saw down. Old Bear Runner remained mounted, rain beating along the old robe over his shoulders. 3 riders near the lower crossing, one on a swayback roan, one with a scar under the eye, one laughing too much for a hungry man. Saxena's face went still. They asked after horses, the old man said, asked which houses kept men and which kept widows. Mara had appeared in the doorway, one hand tight around the frame. Old Bear Runner's eyes moved to Mako. "You should come closer to the families until the road's dry," he told Saxena. "No." The answer came before he finished breathing. "Saxena, Eli is buried here. My horses are here. My stores are here. I don't leave my life because bad men learn to ask questions." The old man looked toward the barn, the fence, the low creek, the cabin with smoke coming from its chimney. Then he looked at Mako again. "Then your wall had better stand when the river brings wolves." Mako said nothing, but the words entered him and found a place. That night, Saxena sorted seeds at the table. Mara slept behind the curtain. Rain whispered against the roof. Mako rubbed beeswax into his boots, working it deep along the seams. "The lower pasture fence won't hold if the creek rises more," Saxena said. "No, 2 posts rotted through last fall. I'll cut new ones. Lodgepole holds better than spruce." "I know." She nodded once. The silence settled again, but it had lost its bite. After a while, Saxena lifted a hand to push loose hair from her face. Her fingers trembled. Only for a breath, only enough to show that iron could tire. Mako looked down at his boots and gave her that small privacy. Before dawn, he woke without knowing why. The cabin was dark. The stove breathed low. Saxena and Mara slept behind the curtain. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn. Then came a sound from far down the lower trail. Not thunder, not creek ice. Hooves moving through wet ground. Mako sat up slowly, his hand already reaching for the knife beside his cot. They rode into the yard, smiling like neighbors. But Mako knew that sound in their laughter. It was the sound wolves make when they find a door with no man behind it. The morning had the weight of a storm before the first drop fell. Clouds pressed low over the 2 Medicine Country, dark and swollen, dragging their bellies across the ridges until the mountains looked bruised. The air smelled of wet iron and thawed earth. Creek water rushed loud below the cabin, brown and angry with melt. Every sound carried strangely in that dampness. The creak of a saddle leather, the suck of mud around a boot, the nervous blow of a horse in the barn. Mako Gray Wolf had risen before the others and gone to the lower fence. His bad leg had argued with him from the first step. The wound was knitting, but not kindly. Each stride pulled the flesh tight under the bandage, and every time his boot sank into the mud, pain climbed up his calf like a hot wire. He said nothing to it. Pain had a mouth only if a man answered. He had cut 3 lodgepole posts and dragged them through the muck behind the barn. Now he stood stripped to his canvas shirt shoulders, dark with sweat driving the first post deep into the wet ground. The maul rose and fell in his hands. Thack! The post sank half an inch. Thack! Mud jumped around the base. Thack! His breath came through his nose, slow and harsh. The rhythm steadied him. The world made sense when it was wood iron, dirt, and force. A rotten post came out. A sound post went in. A fence stood or did not. No hidden meaning, no old grief in the walls, no child's eyes asking what a wolf was. Thack! He stopped to wipe sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist. That was when he heard the laugh, thin, greasy, too pleased with itself. Mako went still. The maul hung in his hands. The sound had come from the front yard beyond the barn, not old Bear Runner's dry grunt, not Mara's rare little burst of child laughter, not Sixina's voice which never wasted itself on amusement, unless something had gone wrong in a way too foolish to ignore. This was a man's laugh, a stranger's. Mako set the maul down without a sound. His body changed before his thoughts did. The tiredness left his shoulders. The limp became something he folded away under the heavier weight of instinct. He moved along the barn wall, keeping low, each step placed where mud would not suck loud at his boot. The barn board smelled of wet pine and horse sweat. Inside, the horses shifted uneasily, heads high, ears forward. They had heard it too. Mako reached the corner and looked around. 3 riders sat in the yard. They wore long canvas dusters dark with mud and rain damp. Their horses were lean ribs showing under winter hair. The middle one rode a swayback roan with a white blaze and mean eyes. The man on the left had a scar under one eye that pulled his lower lid down, giving him a permanent look of mockery. The third kept laughing under his breath, though nothing in the yard was funny. Sixina stood on the porch. The Winchester lay across her arms, barrel-angled toward the floorboards, but ready enough. Her face was flat and pale in the stormlight. She looked smaller from where Mako stood framed by the rough door and the gray yard, but her spine was straight as a lodgepole. Mara was inside. Mako saw the pale oval of her face through the window, low and still behind the glass. His hand closed once. The rider on the roan leaned forward over his saddle horn. "Now, ma'am," he said, voice sweetened with rot. "We ain't asking for charity. We're willing to trade. A hot meal, maybe a little dried meat, and we'll be on our way." "There's no food to spare," Sixina said. The scarred man smiled. A woman always says that before she remembers where she hid the good flour. Sixina's thumb moved near the hammer. "Right on." The laughing man looked toward the barn, then the corral. "Horse looks strong enough. You got more animal than you can feed, widow." "The horse isn't for sale. Everything's for sale when winter's been hard." Sixina lifted the barrel a little. The roan stamped and tossed its head. The lead rider noticed the movement and smiled wider. He had bad teeth. "Careful with that rifle. Kicks mean. Wouldn't want you hurting yourself before we had a chance to help." The other 2 chuckled. Mako felt the sound scrape along the inside of his skull. Sixina said, "The rifle says you're leaving." The scarred man dropped one hand lazily toward the pistol at his thigh. "You ain't going to shoot." "Not unless a man steps right up on that porch, and by then, sweetheart, maybe we're close enough to take that gun gentle." Mara moved behind the window. The laughing man saw her. "Well now," he said softly, "you got a little bird in there too." The yard narrowed. The air left Mako's chest and came back cold. He didn't decide to move. He was simply moving. He stepped out from behind the barn. No shout, no warning, no speech for the men to laugh at, just his body crossing the mud, big and silent and wrong in the way a grizzly is wrong when it appears where men thought only brush stood. The horses saw him first. The roan jerked sideways. The scarred man's horse threw its head up and backed into the laughing man's mount. Leather creaked. Bits rang. The laughing stopped. The scarred man turned. His eyes widened. "Jesus." Mako reached him before the word finished. He caught the man by the front of his duster and dragged him out of the saddle as if pulling a sack of feed from a wagon. The man hit the mud with a wet, heavy sound. Air burst from his lungs. His pistol hand clawed toward his belt. Mako brought his boot down on the wrist. Bone gave under the heel with a soft crack that turned the man's breath into a shriek. The lead rider cursed and drew. His pistol cleared leather, but the roan was dancing under him, fighting the bit eyes rolling white. The shot went wild. It tore through the porch rail a foot from Saxena and sent splinters into the wet air. Mara screamed. One small sound. High. Terrified. Everything in Mako went black around the edges. He lunged for the roan, grabbed the bridle with one hand and yanked down hard enough to bring the horse's head toward its chest. The animal reared. The rider pitched forward. Mako caught his gun belt and hauled him sideways out of the saddle. They hit the mud together. The man fought hard. Fear made him strong. He drove an elbow into Mako's jaw, then a fist into his cheek. Mako tasted blood and dirt. He felt the wound in his calf tear hot under the bandage. None of it reached the part of him that mattered. He rolled on top of the man and closed both hands around his throat. The flesh under his thumbs was soft, too soft. The man's pulse fluttered there, fast and weak like a trapped bird beating against a cage. Mako squeezed. The man's mouth opened. No sound came out. His hands clawed at Mako's wrist nails, scraping skin. His eyes bulged, rain beginning to dot his face. A shape moved at the edge of Mako's vision. The third rider had forced his horse toward the porch, not brave enough to fight Mako, but mean enough to look for easier prey. Saxena raised the Winchester to her shoulder. The barrel settled on the man's chest. "Ride?" she said. He hesitated. From the lower trail came the dry metallic click of another rifle being cocked. Old Bear Runner sat his small dark horse near the creek path, robe wet on his shoulders. Old rifle leveled at the rider's ribs. The old man's voice was quiet. She said, "Ride." The third rider believed him. He wrenched his horse around so fast mud sprayed across the yard. He drove in his heels and fled down the trail, leaving the others behind without one backward glance. Mako did not let go. The man beneath him had turned purple. "Mako." Saxena's voice cut through the roar in his ears. Not a plea, not terror, a command. His hands stayed locked, but the pressure stopped. "Mako," she said again. He looked up. She stood at the porch edge with the Winchester still raised, rain darkening her shawl. Mara's face was pressed to the window behind her, pale and stricken. Old Bear Runner remained mounted near the trail rifle, steady. The world came back in pieces. Mud under his knees, blood on his knuckles, the man choking beneath him. Mara's scream still hanging somewhere inside his skull. Mako opened his hands. The rider dragged air into his lungs with a wet gasp and rolled sideways, coughing and retching into the mud. Mako stood slowly. The yard had gone silent, except for the rain beginning to fall harder. The scarred man lay curled around his broken wrist, sobbing through clenched teeth. The leader crawled backward on his elbows, one hand at his throat, eyes fixed on Mako as if he had seen a thing no preacher had prepared him for. "Get up," Mako said. His voice sounded dead even to himself. The leader stumbled to his feet. He grabbed the scarred man by the collar and hauled him upright. Neither looked for the dropped pistol. Neither looked at Saxena. They lurched toward the horses, mounted badly, painfully, and rode after the third man, bent low in their saddles like whipped dogs. Old Bear Runner watched them until the rain swallowed their shapes. Then he lowered his rifle. No one spoke. Mako stood in the center of the yard with mud to his thighs and blood on his hands. His torn shirt clung to his shoulders. His jaw throbbed. His leg burned with a wet heat that told him the wound had opened again. But none of that was the pain that mattered. He had shown them. He had shown the child. He had shown Saxena the thing that lived under his skin, the thing that had kept him alive in timber mining camps, snow gullies, and bad country where mercy got a man killed before breakfast. He stared down the trail where the riders had vanished. He waited for disgust, for fear, for the flat instruction to gather his bedroll. Rain ticked against the porch roof. Saxena lowered the Winchester. "There's blood on your face," she said. Mako did not move. "Wash at the pump before you come in. I scrubbed the floor this morning." She turned, took Mara gently by the shoulder and guided the girl away from the window. Then she stepped inside and left the door open behind her. The open doorway stood black and warm against the rain. Mako looked at it as if it were another kind of trap. Old Bear Runner rode closer, stopping beside him. The old man studied the mud, the blood, the broken porch rail, then Mako's hands. "You stopped," he said. Mako swallowed. His throat felt full of gravel. "She told me to." Old Bear Runner looked toward the open door. "That is something." He rode toward the barn without another word. Mako went to the pump. The handle was slick under his bloody fingers. He worked it until water spilled cold and clear into the trough. He bent and scrubbed his face, his hands, his wrists. The water stung the split skin. Mud ran off him in brown streams. Blood followed thin and pink, disappearing into the yard. But the feel of the man's throat stayed in his palms. Inside, through the open door, he heard iron set on the stove. A skillet. Then the smell came. Bacon fat. Coffee. A house returning to its ordinary labors after violence had walked through the yard. Melko stood in the rainwater dripping from his beard and understood with a slow, sinking certainty that food after such a thing was worse than being cast out. It meant he had to go inside. It meant he had to face them. He reached for his bedroll because he thought no decent house could keep a man like him. But the widow pulled out the chair he had repaired and said, "Did I tell you to leave?" Mako Grey Wolf stood at the pump until his hands went numb. Rain came down cold and steady, flattening his hair, running through his beard, soaking the torn shoulders of his shirt. The yard had turned to a slick brown soup beneath his boots. Water coursed down the wagon ruts and carried pink threads of blood away from the place where the men had fallen. Their tracks were already losing shape, the mud softening the hard evidence of violence into something the earth could swallow. But his hands remembered. They remembered the throat under them, the small flutter of pulse, the awful ease of closing down another man's breath. Mako worked the pump handle again. The iron squealed. Clear water spilled into the trough, splashing over his wrists. He scrubbed until the skin burned. Mud came loose. Blood came loose. Dirt lifted from the cracks around his knuckles. Still, his palms felt marked. He bent and splashed his face. The cut near his cheekbone stung. His jaw ached where the rider's fist had struck him. His bad leg pulsed with hot, wet pain beneath the bandage. He looked down and saw red seeping through the cloth, again darkening the trouser leg Saxena had cut open and stitched back crudely enough to keep him decent. He should not go inside. That thought came clean and certain. The open door behind him glowed with stove light. Inside were bacon-fat coffee, a child who had screamed, an old man who had watched, and a woman who had called his name before he crushed a man's windpipe in the mud. He had no business stepping over that threshold. The mountains would take him back. They always did. A man could disappear into timber with a rifle, a knife, and enough shame to keep him warm for a while. He had done it before. He could do it again. His leg might slow him, the wound might sour, hunger might find him quicker this time. That was fitting. He dried his hands on the rough towel nailed near the pump, though the rain made the gesture useless. He turned toward the porch. The door remained open. Saxena had left it that way. That was worse than barring it. Mako climbed the steps slowly. Each board groaned beneath him. Mud fell from his boots in wet clumps. He stopped at the threshold and looked in. The cabin seemed too ordinary. The stove gave off a red, steady heat. A skillet sat over the fire bacon, hissing in its own grease. Fried potatoes browned in another pan, their edges dark and crisp. Coffee steamed from the pot. The smell of it all struck him low in the chest. A home smell, a living smell, indecent after the wet violence outside. Saxena stood at the stove with her back to him. Her shawl hung on a peg, rain-dark at the edges. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows. She turned bacon with a fork as if nothing more serious than breakfast had happened. Mara sat at the table. Her hands were wrapped around a tin cup she had not drunk from. Her face was pale, but her eyes were dry. She watched Mako the way a child watches a storm after it has torn the roof from a neighbor's barn, afraid, yes, but also trying to understand what rule of the world had been revealed. Old Bear Runner stood near the door, his rifle unloaded now and leaning against the wall. Rain dripped from the hem of his robe onto the floor. He did not look at Mako's face. He looked at his hands. Mako stepped inside and shut the door softly behind him. The room tightened around him. He moved to the peg and reached for his buffalo coat. His bedroll lay near the stove where he had left it before dawn. He bent to gather it, but the movement pulled fire through his calf. He gripped the bedroll anyway. "What are you doing?" Saxena asked. She did not turn from the stove. Mako kept his eyes on the coat. "I'll sleep in the barn tonight," the bacon hissed. "Why?" He swallowed. His throat felt scraped raw. "I'll be gone at first light." Mara's fingers tightened around the cup. Old Bear Runner said nothing. Saxena moved the skillet off the hottest part of the stove. The sound of iron sliding over iron was small and final. She turned then, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did I tell you to leave?" Mako looked at her. "No. Then why are you packing?" His hand closed around the bedroll strap. "You saw what I am?" Saxena's eyes did not move away from him. Mako hated that most. Fear would have been easier. Disgust would have been clean. Her looking at him plainly left him nowhere to hide. "I ain't a house man," he said. "I ain't fit near a child. I lose hold of myself. You saw it. I had him by the throat and I wanted—" His voice broke off hard. Mara looked down into her cup. Mako forced the words out. "I wanted him dead." Saxena crossed her arms over her apron. "You think I thought you were a preacher when I found you in my hay?" Mako did not answer. "You had a knife in your hand and hunger in your eyes. You stank of blood smoke in the mountain. I knew what I let in. That don't make it right. No, it makes it true." Rain struck the roof harder. The sound filled the spaces between them. Saxena stepped away from the stove. She was not tall. She was not soft. In the yellow stove light with flour dust still caught near one sleeve and rain dampening the loose hair at her temple, she looked worn down to the part of a person that does not bend because bending would mean breaking. "Those men came here because Eli is in the ground," she said, "because they saw no husband at the door, because they thought a widow's rifle was just a stick she held to make herself feel taller." Mako stared at the floorboards. "They did not care that I keep this place alive with my hands. They did not care that the girl sleeps behind that curtain. They did not care that a dead man's name still sits at this table whether anyone speaks it or not." Her voice stayed flat, but the room seemed to lean toward it. "They cared that they saw weakness." Mako's jaw tightened. "I nearly killed him. You stopped because you called me." "Yes, that ought to scare you." Saxena studied him for a long moment. "I'm scared of winter," she said. "I'm scared of fever. I'm scared of a little wound that turns black while a man tells me it is nothing. I'm scared of smiling men who ride into a yard and look at a child through the window." Her eyes moved once toward Mara, then back. "I'm not scared of the man who fixed my latch, turned my wood, dug my trench, and bled in my yard before he let wolves reach my porch." The word struck him harder than a fist. "Wolves!" Old Bear Runner shifted near the door. His old eyes were dark under his brow. "A dog that bites his own people is cursed," he said. "A dog that bites wolves is worth feeding." Mako looked at him. The old man's face held no softness, no praise, only judgment clean and hard as river stone. "You stopped," Old Bear Runner said again. "That matters." Mako had no words for that. Saxena turned to the table and pulled out the chair. The same ladder-backed chair that had cried under his weight the first night, the one he had repaired with glue pegs and patient hands while Mara watched him shave wood curls onto the floor. The one he had thought too weak for him, then made strong enough to bear what it had been given. She set one hand on its back. "Sit." Mako looked at the chair. It seemed a foolish thing to look at so long. 4 legs, worn seat, a patched rail, a little smear of glue he had failed to scrape from the joint. But something in his chest tightened around it until breathing hurt. Mara slid one foot out from beneath the table and nudged the chair farther toward him. Not much, just enough. Miko looked at the girl. She did not smile. She did not forgive him with pretty words. She only moved the chair and kept both hands around her cup. Saxena picked up a plate and forked bacon onto it, then potatoes, then a heel of bread fried in grease. She set it down on the table with a firm sound. "Wash your hands again," she said. "You missed mud on your wrist." Mako looked down. There it was, a brown smear near the cuff stubborn as guilt. He went to the basin and scrubbed with lye soap until the skin reddened. The water clouded gray. He dried his hands on the towel by the stove. His legs shook under him, but he did not sit until Saxena pointed once at the chair. Then he lowered himself. The chair held. No creak, no warning crack, just the solid quiet of mended wood bearing weight. Mako sat very still. Saxena poured coffee and placed it near his right hand. Mara pushed the small dish of salt toward him. Old Bear Runner took his rifle from the wall and opened the door. Rain blew in cold around him. "You'll need to mend the porch rail before dark," the old man said. Mako looked up. Old Bear Runner's mouth twitched not quite a smile. Bullet made a mess of it. Then he stepped out into the rain and pulled the door shut behind him. The 3 of them remained at the table. Saxena sat across from Mako with her own plate. Mara sat between them, small and solemn, tearing a piece of bread into neat bits. Outside, rain hammered the roof and washed the yard clean of shapes. The trail where the riders had fled became a brown stream. The blood in the mud disappeared into water and earth. Inside, the stove breathed. Mako picked up his fork. He didn't eat like an animal this time. He cut the bacon slowly, chewed slowly, let the salt and fat sit on his tongue. The food did not break him. It steadied him. Across the table, Saxena ate without looking at him too long. Mara drank from her cup. No one said he was forgiven. No one said he belonged. No one needed to. The chair held. The door was closed against the storm. His coat stayed on the peg. Mako listened to the rain and understood with a heaviness that was almost peace, that freedom was not always an empty ridge and no voice calling after you. Sometimes freedom was a scarred table, a plate set down after blood, and a woman who had seen the worst thing in your hands and still told you to wash before supper. He had gone into the mountains looking for silence, but the silence that saved him was not the empty kind between trees. It was the quiet around a scarred table where no one asked him to be gentle, only faithful.